Now, as this war continues to draw in more countries, Prime Minister Mark Carney has said he's not ruling out Canadian involvement. While visiting Australia, he said, quote, "Canada will stand by our allies when it makes sense." What does that mean? And what could a Canadian involvement entail? For her insight, we've now reached Wendy Gilmour in Toronto. She's a former Assistant Secretary General for Defence Investment for NATO. Wendy, thank you once again for making time for us today.
Thank you.
So first, I wanted to get your initial reaction to those remarks from the Prime Minister as he's on this trade mission and had a stop in Australia.
I think what he said is entirely pragmatic. The situation is continuing to evolve every day, and Canada's engagement will depend on whether or not there is a requirement for a Canadian response, whether it's to protect Canadian citizens in the region, or whether indeed it's to protect our allies, like we saw the ballistic missile attack on Turkey yesterday and a response by a NATO-commanded force. So Canada will engage, and I'm sure the Prime Minister and his government are looking at it, where it makes sense to do so, where our allies are looking for assistance, and where Canadian interests are directly at stake.
You know, there is a question that has come up on the somewhat shifting positions we've seen of the Prime Minister. His stance has changed since the war started. Initially, he did come out in support of those U.S. airstrikes, but then he went on to call the situation a failure of international order, also saying that he would prefer a diplomatic solution or diplomacy be employed here. So how do you assess these changing positions that we're seeing from the Prime Minister? Where does Canada stand?
One of the most important things to recognize is that when a conflict starts, you can never predict where it's going to go. It is the very nature of war. Our military colleagues would say that the enemy always gets a vote in terms of determining how things will happen. It's important that countries' responses and Canada's response remains flexible to deal with the conditions. I think the Prime Minister's initial statement was very clear that Canadian position for years has been that we were absolutely not supportive of the regime in Iran. It behaved in a way that was sponsoring state terrorism. It was harming, directly attacking its own peoples. But that doesn't say that Canada's position was, we were obviously not part of the original attacks on Iran. But what we need right now, and I think the Prime Minister is showing, is that our response will evolve as the situation evolves. I don't consider that flip-flopping necessarily. I think that is just pragmatism.
When we do talk about the consideration of Canadian involvement, and Mark Carney has said that we'll stand by our allies when it makes sense, what could that look like as we continue to track how this conflict develops?
Well, I think first and foremost, we look sort of through the lenses of our alliance. So if NATO territory is attacked, and in this case, Turkey was the subject of a missile attack. If Turkey requests NATO's assistance, and if NATO has assets to respond, as it did in this instance, then Canada would obviously be part of that response, whether it's direct military engagement or simply our support for NATO institutions and the NATO enterprise as it evolves. I think, our ally, like when we say where it makes sense to do so, it's really from the lens of who is being attacked, what are the interests at stake, and does a Canadian direct response make sense in that instance, or are there other things that we should be doing?
Finally, I wanted to ask you, in terms of the pressure that we know the UK's Prime Minister has been feeling come from the US President Donald Trump, it has been overt and the US President has been very vocal about it. Is there the potential for that to be something that the Canadian leadership is contending with? We know now that, in fact, the UK's Prime Minister has said they're sending 4 fighter jets to Qatar. That is, of course, because Iran has targeted US interests or installments in some of the other Gulf nations. Do you think that sort of pressure could push Canada into this conflict, or that you might see a deployment similar to what we've seen announced today by the UK?
UK response has to be looked at in the context of, number one, it's not just an attack on US installations in Qatar and the UAE and elsewhere. It's an attack on those countries. And there are many British citizens that are there, just as there are many Canadian citizens. There was a direct attack on UK installations in Cyprus. So I think the British response is about responding to an attack on its interests, more so than some of the rhetoric that comes out of the White House. I think we've all learned that President Trump rhetoric, his lashing out, waxes and wanes depending on what his attention is focused on. What is important to focus on is the things we can control, our own response. And so, again, I would go back to, I'm sure that the Canadian government is looking at where Canadian interests are best served. And if a direct response is required, if we are protecting our allied interests, our own interests, if there are obviously responding to Iran's somewhat indiscriminate response across the region, the potential for widening this conflict is very, very present. And I think it's in Canada's interest and in the other, our close allies' interest not to have this conflict expand any further than where it is. So that's where I would think the Canadian government focuses on at the moment.
Wendy, I do want to sneak in one final question with you, in fact, and that is something that we have touched on during the course of our conversation. But we know that NATO air defenses, and you touched on this, shot down Iranian missiles headed towards Turkey. What would be the threshold where NATO could become involved in this conflict?
The NATO ballistic missile defense operation has, since its inception, been very much focused on Iran and Iran's threat that's posed to NATO territory because of their close and intermediate range missiles. NATO, first and foremost, has treaty-based commitments that where one of our allies is attacked, we will collectively respond. And so if Turkey were to invoke, for example, Article 5, if they were to go to NATO and say, we want a collective response, Canada would be part of that response. It's not clear the extent to which Iran is going to continue either to have, what are their stocks of missiles to continue to threaten their immediate neighbors and beyond. It's not clear whether the NATO has assets in Turkey. As I said, their ballistic missile defense and operation is countering Iranian threats. That's what it's designed to do. So the critical thing is it requires Turkey to ask for help beyond what's there right now, and for the NATO nations to respond as they have assets. But I'm sure if NATO collectively decides to engage to defend NATO territory, Canada will be there.
Wendy, I want to thank you for your time and your thoughts on this today. We always appreciate you joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
That is Wendy Gilmour. She's a former Assistant Secretary General for NATO Defence Investment. We reached her in Toronto.